Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the 2022 Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. 10 years ago, IHRB launched the Dhaka Principles for Migration with Dignity. The principles, which many of you know now, were first introduced in Bangladesh, hence the name, and are a framework to help us understand the many challenges faced by migrant workers at all stages of the migration cycle. To celebrate their 10th anniversary, we've been featuring commentaries on the IHRB website with different perspectives on each of the principles. So first of all, I would like to thank everyone who's contributed to those commentaries, but also who contributed over the years with their thoughts, knowledge, and also who challenged us on how and whether the principles are applied. Unfortunately, as we know, principles do not always make practice. And that is particularly true for Dhaka Principle 1, which is one of the main focuses of this forum. Principle 1, which many of us know now as the Employer Pays Principle, or EPP, says that no fees should be charged to migrant workers, and that all costs of recruitment and placement should be covered by the employer. The reason for this principle being the focus of the forum and of much of our work to date is because the payment of recruitment fees impacts on pretty much everything else that happens to a worker throughout their employment. That's why in 2016, IHRB first brought a small group of well-known companies together alongside other partners in an initiative that we all know now as the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. The aim of the Leadership Group was to promote one very clear and simple premise: the Employer Pays Principle. The Leadership Group has now grown to 16 multinational companies, all of them very well-known brands. We have also seen an increasing number of other companies and organizations get behind the EPP. So many companies, in fact, that at this year's forum, I'm very pleased to launch an exciting new initiative, the Responsible Recruitment Register, which is a register of companies, and you'll be seeing a screenshot as I speak, is a register of companies who include this prohibition. This is not a public ranking or benchmark exercise, but we hope that the register will improve transparency and encourage many more companies to adopt responsible recruitment policies and to increase accountability. I'd like to thank in particular my colleagues Rakesh and Carmen, who are the brilliant minds behind the register, and you'll be able to access the register on the IHRB website, on the forum's platform, and we'll also put a link to the register in the chat. So this is our 5th Global Forum. We've had previous editions in person in Berlin, in Singapore, where many of you will have seen me running around heavily pregnant, in Bangkok, and then online last year. Doing it online again has many upsides. Last year, we had more than 1,600 people watch at least one session of the forum, something we could never achieve in person. It also allows us to include greater diversity and have participants from all the significant groups, including workers themselves and their representatives. And that really is the aim of the Global Forum, to bring together those connected with the responsible recruitment agenda, to learn, to discuss, to collaborate. We are fully aware that IHRB is not the only one doing work in this space, and the Global Forum really belongs to everyone. That is why this year we're so pleased to have a large number of sessions organized in partnership with other initiatives. And the hard work of those organizations has added immense value to this year's forum. I would like to thank every one of them on behalf of IHRB. Thank you for your contributions and your time. So this year we have 3 main themes for the forum. The first is action in supply chains, which has a particular focus on grievance mechanisms and access to remedy. The second is the impact of recruitment processes on women migrant workers. And the third is government process and development outcomes. As well as the main webinar sessions that we are all used to now, we also wanted to create some shorter content and quick explainers on some particular issues that people might be interested in. So this year we're introducing a new feature called Insights, which are shorter presentations produced by different organizations and focusing on particular topics or areas of interest. There are also a number of other shorter interviews and some really nice trial versions of apps from our friends at Just Good Work and Quizzer. So please feel free to explore the platform and use it as you wish. Anyway, I've spoken for too long, and the real focus of this session should be the three fantastic speakers that are here with me today. Unfortunately, not physically, but we're all together online. So I have the honor and the pleasure to be joined today by Malcolm Bidali, who is the co-founder of migrantdefenders.org, but who was also a migrant worker himself until not that long ago. And some of you might know him as Noah, or Noah Articulates. That's how he used to write on Twitter. I also have Louise Herring, who is the executive director at AIM Progress and the founder of the Food Network for Ethical Trade. And last but not least, Paul Salus, who leads the IRIS certification program at the International Organization for Migration. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll turn to you first, Malcolm. So first of all, I know you're a very busy man these days. Thank you for taking the time to be here. It's really a privilege to have you at the opening panel of the Global Forum. It's the first time that we have a worker in the opening, and this is very special for us. Many of the participants will have heard about your story as a security guard working in Qatar, was also writing about the working and living conditions of migrants in the country. But I think before we get into that, and before we get into your experience in Qatar, what I'm really interested in is your journey as a migrant. So you are originally from Kenya and then ended up as a security guard in Doha. But my question is, what's in between? Can you tell us a bit more about your hopes and dreams and your aspirations and what led you to go to Doha in the first place?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me on here. I think I just jump straight to it, honestly. What made me leave Kenya, or Nairobi for that matter, is the fact that I was in a very difficult state, financially, mentally, all those things. It was in a very bad place. And in Kenya, if you need to get a job, you need to, for example, know someone. You can't just get a job based on, your qualifications or your papers or anything of the sort. So at the time, I was, like I said, in a very bad place. I wanted to start over, afresh. Didn't matter where, actually. So my neighbor, who was in Dubai, who was working as a concierge in a hotel, found me in this state and presented me with the idea of working in the Gulf. And I was like, I didn't even hesitate. I was like, anything to get me out of Kenya, and that's the mentality of most Kenyans, most migrant workers, basically anything to get them out of the country. So I didn't know anything about Qatar at the time. All I knew was what Google knows, Qatar, flashy cars, skyscrapers, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, opulence, that kind of thing. So I didn't have an idea of any violations or that kind of thing. So I think that covers the first part of the question. Unless there's anything else
Malcolm, you want to add. That's so interesting, and thank you for sharing. This brings me to this exercise that we did at the registration for this year's forum. So people will have been asked to describe migrant workers in 3 words. And it's been a fascinating exercise for us to look at those results. And we've now created a word cloud with the results that people will be able to see. But the first words, or the most popular words, were vulnerable and resilient. And I find it interesting, but not surprising necessarily, that vulnerable is the first one. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts. If you were to describe not just yourself, but migrant workers, what words would you use? Would vulnerable be one of them as well?
I would start with resilient. I was actually surprised that you say that. I would start with resilient because you get to the country and you find the conditions are not what you thought they were, but you still have to deal with it in one way or another. So I would say resilient. I would say resourceful as well. Vulnerable, that depends because we're talking about different clients, different projects, different welfare standards. So it actually depends on where you work. It's not about whether the law says this or the law says that, or this policy or this regulation. It depends on which client. If, for example, you have Qatar Foundation that has the standards, you might find they have maybe better working conditions. But if you find a company maybe like Sephora, for example, which I've worked there before, subcontracted, horrible, you understand? So it depends on the client. Yeah, I don't necessarily have any 3 words to describe migrant workers because that's just condensing it, but resilient, I would definitely say resilient. Yeah.
And it's interesting what you say about the different companies, different countries. I think this nuance is so important in these conversations and in developing policy and when we're thinking about practice and standards, because companies will have their own priorities as well. Governments will have their own regulations. And then, of course, the conditions won't be the same for workers across the board in a single country or even in a single company sometimes. So you talked about your journey and you say resilience is the number 1 trait that probably a migrant has or will develop at some point. So from those hopes and dreams that you had and from, being pretty desperate in Kenya to then arriving in Qatar and now where you are, so what were some of the challenges that you faced? I mean, people who have seen in the news about your detention and then, you being deported as a result of your activism, even when you were a worker. But other than that, even before that, what were some of the main challenges, the daily challenges, not the big events that people see in the news on a daily basis? What were some of the challenges that you faced?
Okay, so my story is not different from other people's story. So I think what I can say can be mirrored to like other migrant workers as well. The first thing that I really had an issue with, some maybe not, but I definitely had an issue with this, was the living conditions. Because for the most part, when you go to work in Qatar or in any Gulf country for that matter, it is work and accommodation. It's a split between the two. So the living conditions, because this is where you spend like a very huge part, actually you spend more time at work than accommodation, I would think. Yeah. Also, yeah, that's a long story. So the living conditions, you are held in cramped living conditions, 6 to 12 people. I have been in a situation where I've been in all these accommodations where you have 6 people in one tiny room, 8 people, 10 people. I know of a place that had 12 people in one room, and you have all your effects, and it's just, there's mold on the wall, bed bugs, and there's sanitation standards are non-existent basically, and food quality. So what happens with food is, again, depending on the client might say, because we have this standards, we want the employees who are going to be working on our projects to be provided with nutritious meals and this and this and this. If the client has no such standards, it's up to the company to decide that. And a company is essentially a business, right? So the main aim is profit. So what they'll do is they'll find the cheapest catering service to provide you the cheapest food, basic, bland, appalling. I wouldn't even call it food, to be honest. You understand? So that they'll also try to find the cheapest mode of transport, the cheapest accommodation, the cheapest way to squeeze you into working 12-hour shifts and all that. Like it's on a day-to-day basis, that's the kind of thing that we went through. And then as a whole, you had repression of freedoms. So for example, freedom of speech. You aren't allowed to speak out on anything that happens within the company, which you might already know. Even journalists have faced these problems when going to Qatar to interview workers. You know, workers are generally skeptical and scared, and you know, no camera, you know, they don't want to be involved in anything because they know the repercussions. You know, you get caught speaking to the media, you know, that's automatic deportation, or maybe some form of retribution, in like your salary deduction or something of the sort. Freedom of movement, you know, because they won't place you in Doha, you know. Doha is like the capital city and surrounded by, you know, great places and all that. But migrant workers are kept in, you know, the industrial area, or sometimes way out of Doha, like 45 minutes, 1 hour, 1 hour, 30 minutes, depending on where the camp is. So that's one thing. Freedom of association. So your employer basically decides every aspect of your life, you know, including who you associate with, because for the most part, you're either at work or you're at the accommodation. And even if you get a day off, which isn't guaranteed, you know, it's in the labor law, but it's not guaranteed. You know, you're supposed to have a day off, but it's not guaranteed. But even if you do, it's expensive for you to maybe travel to Doha, go to the, you know, Corniche, or go to the beaches, the parks, malls. Sometimes you can have people who are barred from entering the malls. They literally say no bachelors allowed. You know, like, what does that even mean? Like, no bachelors allowed. You know, what they're trying to say is no migrant workers allowed, because they say no bachelors allowed. But as you're standing there, you find a local Qatari guy, single, just walks into the mall. The security guard says nothing, you know, but I don't blame the security guards. You know, they're just following policy, which falls back again on the client and the company. So most of the issues that I have faced have been related to either the company or the project or the client. And also the feeling of isolation, you know, and being away from your loved ones for 2 years or even more. And that takes a toll on you, because, for example, if you're at work, if you're fortunate enough to work in the city or something of the sort, so you find you have families walking by together, holding hands, and the children are there running around, you know, causing chaos. You know how kids are. And you just think, oh my God, I wish I had that, you know, but you can't. One, because we're technically not allowed to, even if it's not stated in the contract. Two, it's expensive. The cheapest house in Doha would go for around probably 1,500, you know, and that wouldn't be even enough for like a family. And taking your kids to school would be expensive. Transportation would be expensive. So that whole feeling of you feel less of a human being, and it just gets to you at some point. But like I said, people are resilient, but I don't think it's ideal, because it kind of makes you to be numb. You know, I know a lot of relationships that have taken a toll because of the time spent in the Gulf and all that. And yeah, I don't know, like that's basically like what I can think of.
And it's interesting that you mentioned numb, because I was actually going to say that it makes workers probably feel numb, knowing that this is the reality and there is not much you can do about it. But also for those of us working with the issue, a lot of the times I myself can say that, you know, we hear the stories over and over again, and we try really hard to see how the situation can improve. And at some point, you also start to become numb, and these stories just become the reality, and it shouldn't be the case. But we're here talking about Qatar, and I'll come back to you, Malcolm, in a second. But I want to turn to Louise. Louise, I know you have other commitments, and we're very grateful for you taking the time to be here today. What we hear about Qatar from Malcolm, we know this is not exclusive to Qatar, right? We know this is happening elsewhere, and I think it's important to highlight that. I think there is a lot of focus on Qatar this year because of the World Cup, which, if there is a silver lining of that, is that at least there is some commitment from the government to improve legislation and to work with partners to try and address these issues, at least at the legislation level or the regulatory level. But can you, from your experience, we see here in the UK, the situation is not improving. It's actually getting worse for seasonal workers in terms of legislation bringing, again, modern slavery under immigration, which is, as we know, very problematic. In these contexts, what do you think companies can actually expect from governments, if they can expect anything at all?
Great. Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you for the opportunity to join. I'm really humbled to follow after Malcolm's introduction. I think it's a great way to start the event. Just to introduce AIM Progress for people that don't know it, it's a collaborative global forum of fast-moving consumer goods manufacturers and suppliers. We work together to improve the lives of workers in our supply chains, and responsible recruitment is one of the specific areas that we work on. I think when I reflected on this question about what businesses can legitimately expect from governments, in reality, if you look at the Montreal recommendations, they lay out really clearly, what governments should be doing. And I think they're, an extremely well thought through kind of expert view on what the kind of areas are that governments should focus on. And I think that is what we find with the companies that we work with, is that where the regulatory framework is more supportive, the recruitment picture is more grounded in law, and that makes all the conversations about responsible recruitment, about the employer pays principle, kind of much easier to have, particularly in relation to recruitment fees. The reality is that when we're having these conversations, our companies having conversations with suppliers, often, the conversation will go back to what is in the law, what is this conversation based on? And the voluntary frameworks, the voluntary codes that we have, it's more challenging to have those conversations on really difficult issues like recruitment fees if they're not grounded in law. So I think just to recognise that what should the expectation be from governments, it does start with the legal framework, and it does start with those kind of expectations. I think, though, if we sort of move that on to, in reality, what are the things that we're looking for? And I'm reflecting a little bit here. I think when we, talked about this panel, we reflected a little bit on what had gone on in the UK. You mentioned in the beginning that I was the founder of an organisation called the Food Network for Ethical Trade that was based in the UK. We did a lot of work on recruitment fees in the kind of UK context and responsible recruitment. So if we look at the kind of details of what businesses need from government, I think going into some of those Montreal recommendations, the ideas within that about licensing and regulation and inspection of recruitment intermediaries is a kind of really essential model. What we see in the UK with the Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority, that model has worked really well in that context. And I think it's something that would be really helpful to see applied more broadly and applied more globally. Unfortunately, in that UK context, the licensing model and the regulation model and the inspection model has historically been underfunded and under-resourced. So if governments are going to go down that road, they have to really commit to it and commit to making that work. But I think it's an enormously helpful starting point, to have that within the responsible recruitment process. The other area that I think, businesses would really, appreciate the support from government is around labour inspectorates. I think, again, that's a model that needs strengthening and needs support. There is a question for businesses, I think, about the credibility of our kind of assessment systems, the assessments that are being done of recruitment intermediaries. I think it's this balance between kind of regulation and voluntary activities what we need. But if government can really step up and businesses can support them to kind of step up and strengthen labour inspectorate models, it increases the kind of oversight that's there of recruitment, and it builds the kind of local capacity to do that oversight and inspectorate activities. So those are two areas around licensing and around labour inspection. I then think there's a fourth area, which is about looking at the areas where government and business need to work together. So again, looking at what's in the Montreal regulation recommendations, there are various areas in there about incentivising compliance of recruitment intermediaries, looking at grievance mechanisms for migrant workers, providing support to migrant workers. I think that's really where we need a joint approach, but we do need governments to lead those conversations. We need them to be open to conversations with business, to get businesses around the table and actually say, what are our different roles in supporting these various areas, the incentivisation, the grievance mechanisms, and then the support to migrant workers. Within that, there is a point for kind of government that, again, I would come back to, which is migrant workers need to have equal access to core labour rights. I think, again, without that, it's really problematic for businesses to trying to kind of enforce that. There are some good examples out there, I think, of these kind of models. Again, coming back to what exists in the UK, there's a modern slavery helpline, which is an external grievance mechanism that government had some element of involvement in the kind of setup of, but it's business funded. It runs alongside, the police, the Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority. So it's an effective third party kind of helpline that actually works really well. And, within all of kind of this area, I think I'd touch on as well, how do we actually give support to migrant workers? The regularisation of those workers is a really critical element. Businesses can do a great deal, but if migrant workers aren't regularised, then that's really challenging. Thinking about a kind of couple of other ideas, which I'll just touch on quickly, I think there's another area around kind of government and business working together that is really helpful, which is about the openness of information. Again, we see this both in work in Asia, but also, applies to kind of what I've seen in the UK, is actually businesses really being able to understand much more clearly than they do at the moment, what is the status of the kind of regulations. So if we look, for example, at the, agreements between different governments like, Bangladesh and the examples in kind of Thailand or Malaysia, agreements between governments actually being really clear on the status of those agreements, being really clear on what the regulation is about recruitment fees, getting information from government about what they're understanding about trends in exploitation and trafficking. I think there's a lot more that could be done in terms of information sharing. And then I think finally, sort of the area that I'd touch on is around kind of remedy. So again, I think we need much more open conversations about, how do we actually remediate these situations for migrant workers? We need governments to play a very clear role, judicial role. So where there is illegal activity, where workers are exploited, really showing very clearly that there are legal implications for that, wherever in the kind of supply chain that might have, whoever it is that's involved. I think business needs to step up and remedy these situations, but we need the framework to be there from government. And then the final thing that I'd say about from kind of a UK perspective, and this is kind of unfortunately reflecting on some of the changes that have happened over the last few months, is I think one of the things that's in certain contexts that's needed from government is a robust discussion about the conflation of the immigration and modern slavery agendas. So we've seen the government in the UK in recent months reclassify modern slavery from a safeguarding to an illegal immigration issue. And victims of modern slavery have spoken out really clearly and said that reclassification is going to make it much harder for those who are trafficked and enslaved to receive support. So we need to be very clear that those two agendas and those issues are very different, and we need governments to separate those two out.
Louise, thanks so much. You raised so many good points, and the one that sort of stuck with me is this need for collaboration between government and business, and for them to be around the table discussing these issues together. And you mentioned some pockets of good practice in certain geographies, but even at IHRB, it's one of the big pieces that we haven't been able to crack fully yet. There is so much reluctance still from both sides, sometimes depending on the place, to bring those two groups together and try to find common messages. Sometimes it's also about the narrative and, how we are communicating this. I know you have to go. I just wanted to thank you. And if you have any final reflections, but otherwise, thank you so much for being here with us today, Louise.
Yeah, no, thank you, Julia. I mean, I think I just wanted, I suppose, to make it really clear kind of our position that that it's not, we don't see it just as the role of government to resolve these issues. I think I wanted to make that really clear from an aim progress perspective, that we accept that, if you look at the enablers of ethical recruitment and the things that we need to do to tackle, the recruitment fees issue, we are very clear that we do need more commitments from companies in this area. We need more supply chain transparency. So, that's something that we as companies take responsibility for. We need more transparent recruitment costings. That needs to be a much clearer area that, everyone understands what is it actually costing workers to get from A to B, and how is that factored, into the cost of a product or service. I think we also need, and this picks up, very much on what Malcolm's talked about, and it's a challenge that we really see, not just on this issue, but on many issues. We need a scalable rights holder engagement approach. So we see, amongst, as you've just said, Julia, that there are pockets of good practice. There are pockets where companies, and I know there's obviously a lot of work in the civil society area, are working really hard to hear from migrant workers. What are the challenges you're facing? What has your recruitment journey been like? All the things that Malcolm's been talked about. But we need to find a way to make that scalable so we can build that understanding in, and don't have that answer at the moment, but we're really keen to find it. And I think we also need to change the narrative around capacity building of people in the recruitment supply chain. There's been a lot of training historically of those involved in the recruitment supply chain. There's been a lot of training around responsible recruitment, but what we hear from stakeholders is that actually what's needed often is mentoring, supporting recruitment intermediaries to actually understand how can they run their businesses, to be financially stable. How can they increase their human resource capabilities? So I think that's a change of mindset that we need. And I think just to sort of finish, the ethos of AIM Progress is all about collaboration between businesses, collaboration between manufacturers and suppliers, collaboration with other stakeholders. And I think when it comes to this issue, we're 100% convinced that, the root causes of this are complex. The issue is systemic. And we need collaboration across sectors if we're going to find a way out of this. So, yeah, that would be my final thoughts. But thank you very much indeed for inviting me today.
Thank you, Louise. And you gave me the perfect segue to turn to Power, actually. The piece about working with recruiters is so important, and not just through capacity building, but really going through the process and making it possible to have a viable business, a viable, responsible recruitment business. So, Paul, you lead IOM IRIS, which is all about certification of recruitment agencies, companies. And you actually just awarded the first certification to a recruitment company. So can you talk a little bit about IRIS and the certification process?
Absolutely. Thank you, Julia. Thanks for having me today with you and an opportunity to join this distinguished panel conversation. We all well know that there are still a lot of challenges and often not ready solutions, and a huge body of work still needs to be done to tackle unethical recruitment holistically and by all stakeholders, something that Louise just mentioned in her remarks. At the same time, we thought with friends from IHRB, with you, Neil, and the others, that we will take the opportunity to mention also some positive developments and lead some light in a tunnel, so to speak, so that we are not so discouraged and feel hopeless. So about IRIS, very briefly. Years back, we had this great idea to transform the recruitment industry, and we came up with a concept to set up the voluntary certification scheme for recruiters. At IOM, together with IHRB, with IOE, with World Employment Confederation, at that time it was called CED, ILO, and others, we embarked on developing IRIS. We started with the IRIS standard, then the whole certification scheme. Then we quickly realized that recruiters were not ready. So we set up the capacity building program to help them transition and meet the ethical recruitment expectations and standards. Recruiters were still struggling because there was no demand. So we added to IRIS the employer stream of work so that the demand, the employer clients of the recruiters meet the supply, the recruiters, something what Louise also mentioned just in the remarks a minute ago. Then we quickly realized that what will really give a good push is a like-minded and compatible regulatory framework. to make the otherwise voluntary initiatives like IRIS a little bit less voluntary. The carrot and stick approach, as our friends from World Employment Confederation used to refer to it. For IOM, because IRIS is hosted by IOM, being an international UN intergovernmental organization, it was all natural to include the government stream of work, so we did. Earlier along the way, we also acknowledged the importance of the migrant worker voice in this endeavor. So the stream of work with civil society became a vital pillar of IRIS. Fast forward to now, this is how IRIS works across the 4 pillars, and this is what we call a truly multi-stakeholder approach. All this to enable environment for ethical recruitment, something what previous panelists today already mentioned as an important vital piece, and we have to work together with this. So we try to embrace it in IRIS in a very practical way. And it worked. Now, today we have the first IRIS recruiter certified. It wasn't easy, neither for IRIS nor for the recruiter, and it did take time. But now all the hard and tedious work started paying off. It was not just the training, something what Luis just mentioned, but a lot of hand-holding, mentoring, support, and networking with the business opportunities along the way. Along the journey, we also kept in touch with other similar certifications and initiatives. Clearview, On the Level, Verite, Analyzed Responsible Recruitment Program. We all went through the same struggles, learned the same lessons, and gotten to the same, more or less, results. I guess this is what it takes to transition the industry.
Paul, this is so interesting, and we all know how long it took and how much work. So now that in a way the bar has been set and that you have the first certification, what do you expect to see from the industry, not just in that region, but globally? What would you like to see, say, 5 years from now?
Thank you, Julia. So now we do have the first IRIS recruiter certified. This is We Are Caring Recruitment Agency from Singapore, specializing in the recruitment of domestic workers from Philippines and Indonesia for the private households in Singapore. Interestingly enough, in early days of IRIS, we were not so super keen to start with the domestic workers and care industry because of the known high risks. Then we quickly learned from the good players in the industry that because of these high risks, the professional and responsible recruiters of domestic workers had already have to have in place the robust system of checks and balances for proper due diligence and risk management. Therefore, for them, in a way, it was easier to embrace and take along all these ethical recruitment standards we all are expecting of them. So at the end, interestingly, the first IRIS certified recruiter is a domestic worker recruiter. Now, we have been working together with the hospitality industry, talking about the business opportunities, to send more business opportunities that we are carrying away beyond just the private household employers. And this is the way how we see the scale up and sustainability of the businesses for the IRIS recruiters, even more so IRIS certified recruiters. Another challenge that we faced was the transition and upskilling of auditing and social compliance industry, and create the business case for the audit companies and auditing standards setters to embrace and include ethical recruitment provisions into their codes and auditing protocols. Beyond Verite, which we all know very well, it was mostly new territories for the industry. So we have been all working with Verite and a number of MSIs and other social compliance or actors to embrace this task at hand as well. So you see multi-vector, multipolar, different directional endeavor. So now, what we have beyond just We Are Caring. At this point, we have more recruiters signing up to IRIS, with more specifically 4 more recruiters currently in the IRIS certification pipeline. That's how we technically call it, sort of technical language, from different places around the world and specializing in the recruitment for also not so risk-free sectors: agriculture, services, manufacturing, constructions. These recruiters are catching up quickly, and with a proof of concept now, they have a peer recruiters to team up and work with to make the push, the final push towards the IRIS certification faster. I must say it's also a bit of momentum now. with all these crazy things happening around the world, COVID, supply chain constraints, the great resignation and the shortage of workers, the cost of living crisis. Luis was just saying about the situation with the seasonal worker scheme in the UK, right? Paradoxically, the case, because of those things, for ethical and responsible recruitment became much stronger. All of a sudden, all of these high standard until recently perceived irrelevant requirements became relevant and actually helpful to run a more predictable, risk manageable, and sustainable businesses. Recruiters and employers increasingly go for that, not just because IRIS and others ask them to do so, but realizing that this is actually good for their businesses. It actually helps recruit and run their business in a more efficient and productive way, more lean and clean, as we usually refer to it. There's also this carrot and stick element to it. Over about last 2 years, we have noticed an increase of recruiters asking to join IRIS and get IRIS certified quickly. We usually respond, sure, thank you. At the same time, we indicate that it's not necessarily that quick and easy as it can occur, right? And we also ask them, why did you decide it? Why did you decide to go IRIS? Recruiters recently often reply, because my employer client or my government asked me to do so. So we are very clear about it. We are not entirely there yet, but IRIS and ethical recruitment is increasingly becoming a precondition to access a good business opportunity. It actually started happening now, slow, but steady. And this is also encouraging for us, because for us at IOM and IRIS Secretariat, the IRIS certification is not necessarily the goal in itself. It is more a means to support recruiters and employers to sustain ethical recruitment, lean and clean, for years to come.
This is brilliant, Paul. And, you know, I hope that there is real change coming, and couldn't agree more with you that the momentum, despite the multiple crises that we are experiencing, is actually favorable for this to become a viable business model. Unfortunately, we only have limited time to discuss today, but I think it's fantastic that we were able to cover the worker perspective with Malcolm, you know, the business and government angle with Louise, and now you, Paul, with the recruitment side. But Malcolm, I wanted to bring you back just to ask you a final question or reflection. Now that you have the benefit of this great thing that is hindsight, not that it helps much because you've been through what you've been through already, but also now that you are an activist yourself, a labor rights defender yourself, and in a way you are part of civil society now, you can experience the struggles from that side as well, or the good side of it. But what would you like to see from businesses and from governments now that from where you sit now, to improve the conditions of workers, both in terms of recruitment and employment? What are your hopes and dreams now?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And it feels strange, you know, saying that I'm a part of civil society now. You know, this like 5 years ago, like would have been, you know, impossible for me even to fathom. But anyway, what I've learned and what I've come to understand is it's not that, for example, if we're talking about Qatar, it's not that there's a lack of laws and policies and legislation. There actually is. If you read the Qatar labor law, you'd be actually very surprised, because according to the labor law, it dictates the number of working hours, dictates the living conditions, even measures, like there's a specific provision for worker accommodation standards and regulations that even, how do I put it, calculates like the number of people that should be in a room, you know, per square footage and all that. So we have policies, we have legislation, we have laws. Everything is on paper, right? Even the reforms that happened in 2020, the abolishment of the kafala system, the supposed abolishment of the kafala system, and the introduction of the non-discriminatory minimum wage. So we find that we have all these things in place, we have everything on paper, but when it comes to implementation, that doesn't really happen, because as we speak, there is a labor law. There is, it states people should be paid on time. There's the WPS, which is the wage protection system. It's supposed to automatically flag any inconsistencies, with the salary and all that. But just last month or the other month before that, 60 migrant workers were deported from Qatar for demanding their salary. I don't know if you heard that. And this was when everyone was watching, when the spotlight was on Qatar, So it's I believe they only did that for face value, but when it comes to implementing any of these things, the government's not involved. And for the most part, we want to point fingers at Qatar. Oh, Qatar this, Qatar that, Dubai this, Dubai that. But what about Kenya? Kenya is just as complicit and as complacent. We are the ones who send our people to the Gulf. We're the ones who charge exorbitant recruitment fees, $1,200, all these things. It is Kenyans who are doing this. So people are pointing fingers at Qatar, also point fingers at us. When you do advocacy, you need to do it from both sides. But in hindsight, I think there just needs to be a stronger mechanism for implementing all the existing policies, because Qatar has very good policies. For example, they have minimum wage. Kenya, we do not have a minimum wage. For example, the safety standards at construction sites, Qatar has very good safety standards. Kenya, my goodness, it's a literal hazard, and I can go on and go comparing. If I wasn't doing this, advocacy and all that, I guarantee you, I would have, knowing what I know, I would have looked for a job maybe in Kuwait or Oman or somewhere else, because it's much better there. It's so fascinating, but at the same time, so yeah, I know I went off on a detour, but I just think implementation would be best, because there are already existing legislation, policies, and laws, and the pressure needs to be put on both sides, from the country of origin to the destination. And businesses should have very clear policies on what they accept and what they do not tolerate. Understand? Case in point, I'll just mention one. Last I checked, Sherab Properties, which is owned by Qatar Foundation, had no, for example, policy on racism and that thing, because of a personal thing that I went through. So I checked the website, and I think even multiple companies do not have that. So anyway, I think I'll stop there, because if you allow me, I'll just go on talking for days and days and days. So yeah.
And we could listen for days and days, and you didn't go on a detour at all. Your points were very clear. And I think touching on implementation, but also on the responsibility of countries of origin as well, which hopefully something we'll elaborate more on in other sessions of the forum, are key points as well. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Paul, Malcolm, and Louise, who's had to leave already, so much for being here with us today. It's really fantastic to see that we have one agency now certified through IRIS, and to be here, Malcolm, to be able to speak to you and get your thoughts firsthand. So thank you so much. And before we close, I just wanted to remind people once again to check out the Responsible Recruitment Register. It does look amazing, if I say so myself. And we'll put the link in the chat. And I hope you enjoy the other sessions and the 3 days of... Yes, Paul? Yeah.
Julia, if you don't mind, literally 1 minute, not more. If I could just compliment to what Malcolm said. Like, Malcolm, I couldn't agree more with what you just said about the implementation, right? And I'll just, in our endeavors, we see a lot about, especially when we push for the employer-based principle, we hear a lot, yeah, we know, but workers need to have a skin in the game, right? That's very often we hear, because they need to pay something in order, so that it's real for them and they are treating it responsibly. I would like to flip it slightly the other way around, talking about the implementation, but everybody, all and each separate stakeholder also needs to have a skin in the game. in this and actually put money and resources on the table. Otherwise, it's just the commitment talks and there's no walking the talk, right? And a lot of pointing fingers instead of actually doing some action, what Malcolm was saying, right? Commitment is just words, but implementation does take resources. We all need to realize it before we make the commitment. Otherwise, it's just the talking. So I couldn't agree more with you, Malcolm. It's all about understanding actually what does it actually take to implement what you promised. Over.
Thank you, Paul. And resources, of course, and bringing back a point that Louise made, labor inspection, as we know, in most countries are the most underfunded agencies or groups. And so absolutely commitment, resources, money and people to speak plainly. So once again, I would like to thank the three of you for being here with us today. Remind people to check out the Responsible Recruitment Register. And I really hope you all enjoy the many resources we've prepared for this year's forum. We'll have 3 days of great content that you'll also be able to access afterwards. It will all be available. So thank you and take care.
Thanks for having us. Great panel.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you.